The summer sun beat down on Millbrook's quiet suburban streets as 12-year-old Darius Johnson carefully arranged his homemade chocolate chip cookies on a folding table. His grandmother's floral tablecloth made the simple setup look more professional, and he had carefully written Darius's delicious cookies, $2 each, on a bright poster board with his best handwriting. The young boy had spent all morning baking with his grandmother, Mrs. Patricia Brown, who had taught him her secret recipe. Each cookie was perfectly golden brown, with just the right amount of chocolate chips. The sweet smell attracted several neighbors who were out for their morning walks. "These smell amazing, Darius," said Mrs. Kelly from next door, purchasing 3 cookies. She took a bite and smiled warmly. "Just like your grandmother's. You're becoming quite the baker." Darius beamed with pride. He had already sold 15 cookies in the first hour, carefully placing each dollar in a small metal box his grandmother had given him. The money wasn't just for fun. His mother needed expensive medication for her diabetes, and insurance wouldn't cover all of it. He wanted to help, even if it was just a little bit. Down the street, other children had set up lemonade stands, taking advantage of the hot weather. The Miller twins were selling cups for 50 cents each, while Sophie Parker offered fresh squeezed orange juice. It was a typical summer scene in their neighborhood, one that had played out countless times before. Officer Frank Miller's police cruiser turned onto Oak Street, moving slowly as he conducted his regular patrol. He had been on the force for 15 years and had a reputation among the local residents, not all of it good. Some called him Old School Miller behind his back, and others used less flattering names. The officer's eyes narrowed as he spotted Darius's cookie stand. He pulled his cruiser to the curb, watching as 2 more customers, both elderly women from the nearby retirement community, purchased cookies from the young entrepreneur. Inside his grandmother's house, Darius's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "How's business going, sweetie?" He smiled, quickly typing back about his successful sales, when a shadow fell across his table. Officer Miller stood there, his arms crossed over his chest. His badge caught the sunlight, and his expression was stern. "You got a permit for this operation, son." Darius's smile faded. "A permit, sir?" "Yes, a permit. You can't just set up shop anywhere you want. There are rules." Miller's voice was sharp, cutting through the peaceful morning air. A few houses down, the Miller twins continued selling their lemonade undisturbed. Sophie Parker's orange juice stand was equally unbothered, but Officer Miller's attention remained fixed on Darius. I didn't know I needed one." Darius replied softly, his hands beginning to tremble slightly. "I'm just selling cookies to help my mom with her medicine." Mrs. Kelly, who was still nearby, stepped forward. "Frank, come on now. Kids sell things all the time in this neighborhood. Just last week, your niece was selling Girl Scout cookies right here." Officer Miller turned to her, his jaw set. "This is different, ma'am. Please step back. This is official police business." More neighbors began to gather, drawn by the growing tension. Mr. Rodriguez, walking his dog, stopped to watch. The Martinez family paused their yard work. Even the Miller twins looked up from their lemonade stand, confusion clear on their faces. "Pack it up," Officer Miller commanded, placing his hand on his belt near his handcuffs. "This is an illegal operation." Darius's grandmother had been watching from the kitchen window, and now she hurried outside, her floral apron still dusted with flour. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" "Your grandson is conducting business without proper permits," Miller stated flatly. "That's a violation of City Ordinance 47B. Mrs. Brown's eyes flashed with understanding and anger. "Officer Miller, these are homemade cookies. He's trying to help with his mother's medical bills. Surely you're not serious about this." Several neighbors had their phones out now, recording the scene. The summer breeze carried whispers between them, and the word racism floated through the air more than once. "The law is the law," Miller insisted, his face reddening. "Either he packs up now, or I'll have to take official action." Darius began carefully placing his cookies back in their container, his lower lip trembling. He had worked so hard on them, getting up early to help his grandmother mix the dough just right. Now everything was falling apart. "Wait," called out a new voice. Linda Martinez, who owned the local bakery, stepped forward from the growing crowd. "Officer Miller, I have all the proper permits for my business. What if I say he's operating under my license? He could be my temporary employee." Officer Miller's face darkened. That's not how it works, ma'am. You can't just make up rules as you go along. Step back, or you'll be interfering with police business. Mrs. Brown placed her hands on Darius's shoulders protectively. He's just a child, officer. Please, use some common sense here. But Miller had made up his mind. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal glinting in the sunlight. Young man, put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for operating without a permit and resisting an officer's commands. The crowd gasped. Mrs. Kelly started crying out in protest. Mr. Rodriguez began recording on his phone, his hands shaking with anger. The Martinez family moved closer, their faces showing disbelief and outrage. You can't be serious, Mrs. Brown exclaimed, her voice breaking. He's 12 years old. But Officer Miller was already reciting the Miranda rights to a trembling Darius, whose chocolate chip cookies lay forgotten on the table. Tears rolled down the boy's cheeks as the cold metal handcuffs clicked around his small wrists. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as Officer Miller led Darius to his patrol car. Mrs. Brown followed, calling the family's lawyer on her cell phone. The other children had abandoned their stands, watching wide-eyed as their friend was placed in the back of the police cruiser. As the patrol car pulled away, Mrs. Martinez picked up her phone and dialed the local news station. Mr. Rodriguez was already uploading his video to social media. Mrs. Kelly hugged Mrs. Brown, who stood staring after the police car, her grandson's cookie container still clutched in her hands. The peaceful summer morning had transformed into something ugly and unfair, but the community of Millbrook was already mobilizing. Within hours, the video would spread across social media, drawing attention to their small town and the actions of Officer Frank Miller. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the patrol car disappeared around the corner, Mrs. Brown whispered, "Don't worry, baby. We're going to make this right." She looked at the gathering of neighbors, seeing the determination in their eyes, and knew that Millbrook was about to change forever. The sweet scent of chocolate chip cookies still lingered in the air, a reminder of how something so innocent had turned into something so wrong. But sometimes, as the residents of Millbrook would soon learn, the worst situations can lead to the most unexpected and powerful changes. The ride to the police station was the longest 10 minutes of Darius Johnson's young life. Through tear-filled eyes, he watched his familiar neighborhood streets pass by through the patrol car's window. His wrists hurt from the handcuffs, which felt too tight on his small frame. Officer Miller drove in stern silence, occasionally glancing at the boy through his rearview mirror. At the Millbrook police station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer Miller led Darius through the front doors. Several officers looked up from their desks, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern when they saw the handcuffed child. Officer Betty Carter, a veteran of the force, immediately stood up from her desk. "Frank, what's going on here?" she asked, her eyes fixed on Darius's tear-stained face. "Operating a business without proper permits and resisting an officer's commands," Miller replied stiffly, guiding Darius toward the processing area. Officer Carter's eyebrows shot up. "A business? What kind of business?" "He was selling cookies without a permit," Miller stated, reaching for his paperwork. The room fell silent. Officer Carter's face hardened as she watched Miller begin the booking process. Several other officers exchanged worried glances, and the desk sergeant, Paul Dixon, picked up his phone to call the chief. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, Mrs. Brown had arrived at the station with Mr. Howard Peterson, a local civil rights lawyer who lived 3 streets over. They rushed through the entrance just as Officer Miller was taking Darius's fingerprints. "Stop this immediately," Mr. Peterson demanded, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. "I'm this child's legal representative, and I'm ordering you to cease this ridiculous process right now." Mrs. Brown rushed to her grandson, pulling him into a tight hug as soon as Officer Carter removed his handcuffs. "Baby, are you okay? Did they hurt you?" Darius could only nod, burying his face in his grandmother's floral dress. The smell of cookie dough still clung to her clothes, a painful reminder of how the morning had started so hopefully. Police Chief Greg Sanders emerged from his office, his face grave. He'd already seen the video. It had gone viral in the hour since the arrest, with over 50,000 views and climbing. Local news vans were already setting up outside the station. "Officer Miller, my office." "Now," Chief Sanders ordered, his voice tight with controlled anger. He turned to Mrs. Brown and Darius. Ma'am, I want to personally apologize for this incident. We'll be conducting a full investigation. As Miller followed the chief into his office, the door closing firmly behind them, Officer Carter brought Darius a cup of water and a tissue. She sat with him and his grandmother while Mr. Peterson made phone calls in the corner. Outside the station, the crowd from the neighborhood had grown. The Martinez family had closed their bakery early to join the protest forming on the sidewalk. Mrs. Kelly had made signs reading "Cookies are not a crime" and "Justice for Darius." Mr. Rodriguez's video had been shared by several civil rights organizations, and reporters were interviewing the neighbors about Officer Miller's history in the community. Inside the chief's office, the confrontation was heating up. "What were you thinking, Frank?" Chief Sanders demanded, throwing the viral video up on his computer screen. "A 12-year-old selling cookies? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Sir, the law is clear about operating without proper permits," Miller insisted, standing at attention. "Don't give me that nonsense," Sanders snapped. "We both know what this was about, and it stops now. I got the mayor on one line and the ACLU on another. This department will be lucky if we don't end up under federal investigation." As they argued, Darius's mother, Lisa Johnson, rushed into the station. She had left work at the hospital where she served as a nurse's aide as soon as she saw the video on her break. Still wearing her scrubs, she gathered her son in her arms. "Mom," Darius whispered, "I was just trying to help with your medicine money." Lisa held her son tighter, fighting back tears. "I know, baby, I know. You didn't do anything wrong." Mr. Peterson approached them with news. "The chief wants to release a formal apology, and they're dropping all charges immediately. We can file a civil rights lawsuit if you want to pursue that option." Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. Local business owners had joined the protest, many of them bringing stories about Officer Miller's previous behavior. The owner of the corner store talked about how Miller had followed black customers around his shop. The high school coach mentioned how Miller had stopped the basketball team's van 3 times in one season for routine checks. Back in the chief's office, Miller's defense was crumbling. "Sir, if you look at my record." "I am looking at your record," Sanders interrupted, pointing to a thick file on his desk. "I'm looking at 15 years of complaints that we should have acted on sooner. This ends today, Frank. Turn in your badge and gun. You're suspended pending a full investigation." Miller's face reddened. "You can't do this. I was enforcing the law." "No, Frank, you were enforcing your prejudices, and you used a child to do it. Now get out of my sight." As Miller stormed out of the office, he passed the break room where Darius sat with his family, Officer Carter, and several other officers who had brought him snacks and soft drinks. The boy was still shaken, but the kindness of these officers was helping him understand that not everyone in uniform shared Miller's views. Chief Sanders approached the Johnson family, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Brown, young man, on behalf of the Millbrook Police Department, I want to apologize for what happened today. This is not what we stand for, and we will do better." Lisa Johnson stood up, her voice firm but kind. "Thank you, Chief, but apologies aren't enough. We need real change in this community." The chief nodded. "You're absolutely right, and if you're willing, I'd like your help making those changes." Outside, the protest had turned into something of a block party. The Martinez family was giving out free pastries, and someone had set up speakers playing music. Signs demanding justice mixed with others calling for community unity and police reform. Mrs. Kelly had retrieved Darius's cookies from his grandmother's house and was selling them to the crowd, with all proceeds going to his mother's medical fund. The line stretched around the block, with people paying far more than the asking price for each cookie. As the Johnson family finally left the station, they were met with cheers and hugs from their neighbors. Darius, still clutching his mother's hand, managed his first smile since the morning when he saw how many people had come to support him. "See that, baby?" his grandmother whispered. "Sometimes bad things happen, but they show us who our real friends are, and sometimes they lead to changes that needed to happen all along." Darius looked up at the crowd of faces, black, white, brown, young, and old, all united in support of him and against injustice. He squeezed his mother's hand tighter and nodded. The day wasn't over yet, and neither was the story of how a batch of cookies would change Millbrook forever. The morning after Darius's arrest, Millbrook woke up to find itself in the national spotlight. Major news networks had picked up Mr. Rodriguez's video, and social media was ablaze with outrage. The small town's name was trending on every platform, and reporters filled the local coffee shop, eager to cover the story that had captured the nation's attention. Susan Clark, owner of Clark's Legal Services and a retired civil rights attorney, sat at her kitchen table watching the coverage. She had fought similar battles 30 years ago, and seeing Darius in handcuffs brought back painful memories. After her third cup of coffee, she made a decision that would change everything. "Janet," she called to her assistant, "cancel all my meetings today. We have work to do." Across town, at Martinez Family Bakery, Joe Martinez was also making plans. He had already called Mrs. Brown and invited Darius to learn professional baking skills at his shop. Now, he was organizing local business owners for an emergency meeting at the community center. The community center's main hall was packed by noon. Business owners, religious leaders, teachers, and concerned citizens filled every chair. Principal Harris from Millbrook Elementary sat next to Coach Lewis from the high school. Dr. Sarah Watson, the town's most respected pediatrician, stood against the wall with other medical professionals from the hospital where Darius's mother worked. Susan Clark took the podium, her voice strong and clear. What happened to young Darius Johnson isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about systemic problems that have gone unchecked in our community for too long. She laid out a plan. The business owners would create a youth entrepreneurship program, teaching kids about permits, business basics, and their rights. The lawyers would provide free legal workshops. The teachers would develop new curricula about civil rights and community engagement. Joe Martinez stood up next. "My bakery will host the first youth business workshop this Saturday. We're going to teach these kids how to turn their dreams into reality, legally and safely. And yes, we'll be making cookies," he added with a smile. The crowd chuckled, but their determination was serious. Mrs. Kelly raised her hand. "I've started a medical fund for Lisa Johnson. We've already raised $12,000 from cookie sales yesterday." In the police station, Chief Sanders was meeting with his officers. Officer Betty Carter had developed a new community outreach program, and young officers were eager to volunteer. They would attend community events, host coffee with a cop meetings, and work with local youth groups. "We need to rebuild trust," Chief Sanders explained. "And that starts with us admitting our mistakes and showing real change." At Millbrook High School, students organized their own response. The Student Council, led by Ashley Banks, planned a bake sale to support Darius. They also started a petition for mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all public servants in Millbrook. Meanwhile, Darius was trying to process his newfound fame. News vans still parked outside his grandmother's house, and his phone kept buzzing with messages of support from across the country. But what touched him most was the way his neighbors rallied around his family. Mrs. Martinez brought fresh bread every morning. Mr. Rodriguez's teenage sons mowed their lawn without being asked. The Miller twins, whose lemonade stand had been untouched during Darius's arrest, came by with their parents to apologize for not speaking up sooner. One afternoon, while Darius helped his grandmother bake a fresh batch of cookies, they heard singing outside. The local church choir had gathered on their lawn, performing gospel songs of hope and resistance. Neighbors joined in, and soon the whole street was filled with music. Lisa Johnson watched from the porch, tears in her eyes. Her coworkers at the hospital had donated their vacation days so she could take time off to be with Darius. The hospital administration, facing public pressure, had finally approved her insurance appeal for her medication. Susan Clark's office became the headquarters for the community's legal response. She worked with Mr. Peterson to file a civil rights lawsuit, not just for Darius, but for everyone who had faced discrimination from Officer Miller over the years. People lined up to tell their stories, each account strengthening their case. The mayor's office couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. Mayor Alice Burns announced the formation of a civilian police oversight committee, with Lisa Johnson and Mrs. Brown among its first members. The committee would review police policies, handle complaints, and ensure transparency in law enforcement. At the Martinez Bakery, Darius attended his first baking lesson. Joe Martinez showed him how to measure ingredients precisely, explaining the science behind perfect cookies. Other kids from the neighborhood joined in, turning the lessons into a community gathering. See, Darius, Joe explained while demonstrating how to cream butter and sugar. Baking is about bringing people together. Just like what you did, without even trying. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Message, ran a special series titled Our Town, Our Truth, featuring stories of discrimination and hope from community members. The editor, who had initially hesitated to cover such controversial topics, found his paper's circulation numbers soaring. 1 month after the arrest, the community organized a street fair called Cookies for Justice. Every baker in town contributed treats, and proceeds went to a new scholarship fund for minority students interested in law enforcement or public service. The goal was to change the system from within. Darius set up his cookie stand at the fair, this time with all proper permits, paid for by the community, and a line of customers that stretched for blocks. Officer Betty Carter bought the first cookie, making sure news cameras captured the moment. But more importantly, she stayed to talk with Darius about his experience and his hopes for the future. Sometimes, Mrs. Brown told her grandson as they watched the crowd at the fair, it takes something bad to wake people up. But once they're awake, real change can happen. The change in Millbrook was real and ongoing. Police officers attended community events, not as authority figures but as neighbors. Business owners mentored young entrepreneurs regardless of their background. Teachers incorporated discussions about civil rights and social justice into their daily lessons. And in the middle of it all was a 12-year-old boy who had only wanted to help his mother buy medicine. Darius Johnson hadn't asked to be a symbol of change, but he and his cookies had become exactly that. A reminder that injustice could be confronted and overcome when a community stood together. As the sun set on the street fair, Darius sold his last cookie and counted his earnings. But the real profit wasn't in his cash box, it was in the transformed faces of his neighbors, the new friendships being formed, and the promises being kept to make Millbrook a better place for everyone. Officer Frank Miller sat alone in his living room, staring at the TV screen where his face appeared yet again in the evening news. His daughter Amy's words from dinner still rang in his ears, cutting deeper than any official reprimand or public criticism. "Dad," she had said, her voice trembling, "that could have been me. Remember when Mom and I used to sell lemonade, before she—" Amy hadn't finished the sentence, but she didn't need to. Miller's late wife had been Korean, and their daughter had faced her own share of prejudice. Now, 2 weeks into his suspension, Miller couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Darius Johnson's frightened face. The boy was the same age as his daughter when her mother died, when she had tried selling lemonade to help with the medical bills. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Miller opened the door to find Officer Betty Carter standing on his porch. "We need to talk, Frank," she said simply, holding up a paper bag that smelled like fresh coffee and donuts. Over the next hour, Betty shared stories from her 20 years on the force, times when she, as a black female officer, had faced discrimination both in and out of uniform. But she also talked about growth, about officers who had changed their ways after similar wake-up calls. "The question isn't whether you made a mistake," Betty said, stirring her coffee. "The question is what you're going to do about it now." Across town, Darius was adjusting to his own changes. The Martinez Bakery had become his second home, where he spent afternoons learning not just about baking, but about business planning and customer service. His cookies now sold in local stores, with part of the proceeds still going to help other families with medical expenses. One morning, Amy Miller walked into the bakery. She had been watching her father struggle with guilt and shame, and she had an idea. After buying a dozen cookies, she asked to speak with Darius and his mother. "My dad. He made a terrible mistake," Amy began, her hands wrapped around a cookie. "But he's not the same person he was 2 weeks ago, your story. It made him remember things he tried to forget." Lisa Johnson listened carefully as Amy told them about her mother, about the lemonade stand, about the years of watching her father build walls around his heart after his wife's death. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Amy said. "I'm asking for a chance to help him make things right." That weekend, the first session of Millbrook's new Community Bridge program began at the community center. Officer Miller sat in the back row, out of uniform, listening as community members shared their experiences with law enforcement. When Darius's grandmother spoke about watching her grandson being handcuffed, Miller couldn't hold back his tears. During the break, he found himself face to face with Mrs. Brown. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm so deeply sorry." Mrs. Brown studied him for a moment. "Words are easy, Officer Miller. Actions are what matter now." "I know," he replied. "I want to learn. I want to change. I need to change." Over the next few weeks, Miller threw himself into the program. He attended every session, took pages of notes, and started volunteering at the youth center. He requested additional training in cultural sensitivity and bias recognition. Most importantly, he started listening, really listening, to the people he had once judged so harshly. The transformation wasn't easy. Some community members remained skeptical, and Miller often went home feeling overwhelmed by the depth of his own prejudices. But slowly, with support from his daughter and unexpected allies like Officer Carter, he began to see the world through new eyes. One day, while helping at a youth entrepreneurship workshop, Miller found himself working alongside Darius. The boy was teaching younger kids how to calculate pricing for their products, showing a natural talent for business. "You know," Miller said during a quiet moment, "my wife would have loved your cookies. She always said food brings people together." Darius looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe you could tell me about her sometime. Amy says she was a great baker too." It was a small moment, but it marked a turning point. The man who had once arrested a child for selling cookies was now learning from that same child about community, forgiveness, and growth. Chief Sanders watched Miller's progress with interest. While the formal investigation continued, he saw genuine change in his officer. When Miller submitted a proposal for a new youth mentorship program, focusing on building trust between police and minority communities, the chief gave it serious consideration. The program would pair officers with young entrepreneurs, providing guidance on legal requirements while learning about the communities they served. Miller had already recruited several officers and business owners as mentors. "It's not enough to admit we were wrong," Miller explained during his presentation to the police commission. "We need to actively work to prevent these mistakes from happening again." Lisa Johnson, now a member of the Civilian Police Oversight Committee, watched Miller's presentation with mixed emotions. The man who had handcuffed her son was now advocating for changes she had long fought for. It was complicated, messy, and somehow hopeful all at once. After the presentation, Miller approached her hesitantly. "Mrs. Johnson, I know I can never fully make up for what I did, but I want you to know that your son didn't just change me, he helped me remember who I used to be, before grief and fear made me forget." Lisa considered his words carefully before responding. "Officer Miller, change isn't just about remembering who you were. It's about choosing who you want to become." As Miller drove home that evening, he passed the spot where he had first seen Darius's cookie stand. The neighborhood had changed. New signs welcomed visitors to Millbrook. A community united, and local businesses displayed posters promoting youth entrepreneurs. Amy was waiting at home with a surprise. She had baked cookies using her mother's recipe. As they sat together, tasting the cookies and sharing memories, Miller realized that his transformation wasn't just about professional growth or public redemption. It was about healing his own heart. "Dad," Amy said, "Mom would be proud of you now, not for who you were, but for who you're becoming." Miller looked at his daughter, seeing in her face traces of her mother's strength and wisdom. "We've all got more growing to do," he said, reaching for another cookie. "But at least now we're growing together." 1 year after the cookie stand incident, Millbrook had become a different town. The changes were visible everywhere, from the thriving youth-run businesses to the new community programs that brought people together across old dividing lines. Darius Johnson, now 13, stood behind the counter of his own small bakery corner inside Martinez's shop. His Cookie Dreams brand had grown into a local success story, with his treats being sold in shops across 3 neighboring towns. A framed newspaper article hung on the wall, telling the story of how a simple cookie stand had transformed a community. "Order up," Darius called out, carefully boxing a dozen chocolate chip cookies. His customer was none other than Officer Frank Miller, no longer in uniform, but wearing the polo shirt of the Millbrook Youth Mentorship Program he now directed. "Thanks, Darius," Miller said, accepting the box. "The kids at the center love these. Think you could teach them your recipe next week?" "Sure," Darius replied with a smile. "But remember, Grandma's secret ingredient stays secret." The youth mentorship program had become Miller's life work after leaving the police force. Rather than returning to active duty, he had chosen to focus on building bridges between law enforcement and young people. The program now operated in several nearby towns, with Millbrook serving as a model for community policing reform. At the Millbrook Police Department, Chief Sanders sat with Lisa Johnson and Mrs. Brown, reviewing the latest statistics. Complaints against officers had dropped by 70%. Community trust ratings had soared. The department's new training programs, developed with input from the Civilian Oversight Committee, were being studied by police departments across the state. "We're not perfect yet," Chief Sanders admitted, "but we're moving in the right direction." "Progress isn't about being perfect," Mrs. Brown replied, her voice gentle but firm. "It's about being better today than we were yesterday." Outside, the summer streets were alive with young entrepreneurs. The permit process had been simplified, and the Youth Business Association, founded by Darius and Amy Miller, helped kids understand their rights and responsibilities. Every Saturday, the town square hosted a youth market where young people could sell their products and learn business skills. Amy, now a regular volunteer at these markets, helped younger children set up their stands. She had become something of a big sister to many of them, especially those who reminded her of herself at their age. "Remember," she told a nervous 10-year-old girl setting up her first craft stand, "you have every right to be here. And if you need anything, just look for someone wearing this." She pointed to her volunteer badge, which bore the program's logo, a cookie with a heart in the center. At the community center, Officer Betty Carter led a training session for new police recruits. The walls were covered with photos of community events, including one of Darius and Miller teaching a baking class together. "Your job isn't just to enforce the law," Carter explained to the attentive recruits. "It's to serve and protect everyone in this community. And sometimes that means learning from those we once thought we needed to teach." The afternoon sun found Darius and his mother visiting the hospital where she worked. Thanks to the success of his business and changes in the hospital's policies, Lisa Johnson's medical care was now fully covered. But they still came every month, bringing cookies to the children's ward and spending time with families facing their own medical challenges. "Mom," Darius said as they walked through the bright corridors, "remember when I just wanted to help with your medicine money?" Lisa hugged her son close. "And look at all the people you're helping now." Back at Martinez's bakery, Joe Martinez watched with pride as Darius taught a group of children how to measure ingredients. The boy who had once been arrested for selling cookies was now a respected young business owner and mentor. "The secret," Darius told his students, "isn't just in the ingredients, it's in why you're baking. When you bake with love and purpose, people can taste the difference." Frank Miller, sitting in the back of the class with his daughter, nodded in agreement. His own transformation had taught him a similar lesson about police work, that the intention behind actions mattered as much as the actions themselves. As evening approached, the Millbrook Town Council gathered for a special session. Mayor Burns presented the first annual Community Bridge Awards, recognizing individuals who had contributed to positive change in the town. The recipients included Darius Johnson, Frank Miller, and the entire Martinez family. "A year ago," the mayor said, "our town made national news for all the wrong reasons. Today, we're making news for showing how a community can grow through its challenges. Each person in this room has contributed to that growth." After the ceremony, families gathered in the town square for a community dinner. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes from every culture represented in Millbrook. Darius's cookies held a place of honor at the dessert table, alongside treats from other young bakers he had mentored. Mrs. Brown watched her grandson move confidently through the crowd, chatting with police officers and business owners who had once been skeptical of a young black entrepreneur. She remembered the tears and anger of that first day and marveled at how far they had come. "Sometimes," she said to Lisa, "the best recipes take time to perfect, just like community." As the stars came out over Millbrook, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the square. Officer Carter's recruits mingled with youth entrepreneurs. Chief Sanders shared a table with former critics turned allies. Frank and Amy Miller helped serve desserts alongside the Johnson family. Darius stood at the center of it all, handing out cookies and sharing his dreams for the future. He had plans to expand his business, to help more kids start their own ventures, to keep building bridges in his community. "You know what's funny?" he said to Miller as they cleaned up after the event. "If you hadn't arrested me that day, none of this might have happened." Miller paused, considering the young man's words. Sometimes our worst mistakes lead to our best chances to grow. Thank you for giving me that chance. As the last families headed home, carrying leftover cookies and renewed hope, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like stars. The town had learned that true change wasn't just about policies or programs. It was about people choosing to see each other differently, to listen more carefully, to grow together. And it had all started with a boy, a cookie stand, and the unexpected journey from confrontation to transformation that had changed not just two lives, but an entire community.